On June 25, 1876, the expansive plains of Montana became the backdrop for one of the most notorious battles in American history, the Battle of Little Bighorn. As the dust settled and the sounds of gunfire faded, a young lieutenant named Winfield Scott Edgily emerged as one of the few survivors from Custer's ill-fated 7th Cavalry. In this compelling first-hand account, Edgerly details the harrowing events of that pivotal day, from the initial confrontations to the final, desperate stand. With unwavering honesty and vivid descriptions, Edgerly captures the chaos, bravery, and tragedy of Custer's last stand. Prepare for a historical experience unlike any other as we transport you back to that significant day in 1876. So, sit back, relax, and join us on this intriguing journey. As you view this video, please remember to click the like button and subscribe to our channel to support our community. On the morning of June 25, 1876, at approximately 10 o'clock, we found ourselves about 15 miles from the enemy's camp, with our entire force assembled. We paused while General Custer ascended a hill with several scouts to survey the Indian camp, which was clearly visible. Upon his return, he convened a meeting with all the officers, informing us that the Indians had detected our presence and that his scouts had pursued a few of them, but they managed to escape and alert the others. The plan was to launch a direct assault on the village. It was believed that the Native Americans would not resist significantly against the full cavalry regiment and would likely attempt to escape upon noticing their approach. General Custer instructed the troop commanders to prepare their men for departure, and within a minute, they were all set to move. General Custer, along with his adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Cook, organized the regiment into 4 battalions, each commanded by a senior officer, Major Reno, Lieutenant Colonel Bentine, Major Keogh, and Captain Yates. He directed Major Reno to advance directly down the valley towards the Indian village and initiate the attack, with additional support to follow. Lieutenant Colonel Bentine was tasked with moving to the left at an angle of approximately 45 degrees from Reno's path to engage any Indians he encountered. The strategy was predicated on the assumption that the Indians would flee either to the right or left. Captain McDougal was assigned as the rear guard, responsible for overseeing the pack train. The specific orders given to Major Keogh and Captain Yates remain unknown, but they departed with 5 companies, comprising around 250 to 300 men, in a direction parallel to Reno's advance. The last sighting of General Custer alive was as he proceeded in the aforementioned direction. Lieutenant Colonel Bentine followed his orders and soon encountered a series of elevated hills. He dispatched Lieutenant Gibson to the summits of several hills to scout for any visible Indians along his route. Lieutenant Gibson reported multiple times that there were no indications of Indians, prompting Lieutenant Colonel Bentine to veer to the right. Approximately 5 or 6 miles from their starting point, they discovered Major Reno's trail and pursued it swiftly. While following the trail, a trumpeter from General Custer's staff arrived with a message for Lieutenant Colonel Bentine. The message stated, "Hurry, large village, bring supplies." Signed, Lieutenant Colonel Cook, Adjutant. We continued our advance, and approximately 3 miles from the village, we observed combat occurring in the valley. Shortly thereafter, we spotted over 100 individuals making a swift move towards the bluffs across the Little Bighorn River, where the village was situated. They crossed the river and disappeared into the hills, while we remained on the opposite bank at a considerable distance. The orderly who delivered the message informed us that Custer's forces had caught the village by surprise and were gaining the upper hand. Consequently, I assumed that the fleeing individuals were Native Americans being pursued by our troops. We hurried toward the ford where Reno's men had crossed, intending to provide them with support. As we neared the location, a Crow Scout with a partially yellow face signaled for us to ascend the hill to our right. We complied and climbed the hill. Upon reaching the summit, we encountered Lieutenant Colonel Reno and his men, who were attending to several wounded soldiers in urgent need of water. To our astonishment, we discovered that they had been compelled to retreat from their position. Some Native Americans remained in the vicinity, concealed behind rocks and hills, firing upon us. We established a skirmish line and swiftly drove them away. Then we heard intense gunfire emanating from the area, where we would later find the remnants of General Custer's unit. We observed clouds of dust and horsemen moving back and forth across the river, approximately 4 miles away. During this time, Captain Weir, my commanding officer, inquired about my thoughts on our next course of action. I suggested that we should certainly attempt to assist General Custer. He concurred, and I heard our first sergeant echo the same sentiment. He then asked if I would be willing to lead D Troop to support Custer should he obtain the necessary permission. I agreed to accompany Captain Weir. He approached Lieutenant Colonel Reno and Lieutenant Colonel Benteen, and soon returned, mounted his horse, accompanied by an orderly. They rode off toward the direction of the earlier gunfire, which had mostly subsided. I initially believed he had obtained permission to lead the troop, but he later clarified that he had not requested it. I mounted the troop and proceeded to follow him. After traveling a few hundred yards, I turned right into a narrow valley, likely the same one that Custer's men had traversed. We advanced toward the main Indian force, which we had observed from a distance. As we descended the valley, Colonel Weir, who remained on the bluff to our left, spotted a significant group of Indians approaching us. He signaled for me to redirect the troop back to his location, which I promptly did. Upon reaching the bluff, I encountered Lieutenant Colonel Benteen, Captain French, and Lieutenant Godfrey approaching with their respective troops. We continued along the bluff until the Indians began firing at us. We dismounted and established a line on the ridge, returning fire for approximately 30 minutes. Subsequently, under General Reno's orders, we retreated to our original position. During our withdrawal, we suffered the loss of one man and one horse. However, the Indians quickly pursued us, firing their Winchesters. Once we regrouped with Reno's forces, we observed the other troops positioned along the hill's crest. Weir's and Godfrey's troops aligned alongside us, extending our defensive line. Soon after, the Indians launched an attack, firing heavily, though most of their shots passed over our heads. The battle continued for over an hour until dusk, marking the conclusion of the first day's combat. The following morning, just before dawn, the Indians initiated another assault from a distance, firing heavily until around 10 a.m. After the morning skirmish, there was a noticeable decrease in gunfire, although small groups of Indians could still be seen on the surrounding ridges. In the afternoon, the Indians across the river began dismantling their teepees and departed around 4 p.m. From our position the previous day, we experienced minimal casualties. We remained in place, relocating to a nearby position that night. The next morning, Lieutenant Bradley, the commander of General Terry's scouts, arrived to inform us that General Custer and his entire unit had been killed. General Terry soon arrived with his column and assigned our regiment the grim task of burying the deceased. The first casualties we encountered were Lieutenants Calhoun and Crittenden, along with soldiers from L Troop. The officers' remains were positioned just behind their men, arranged in a precise skirmish line, exactly where they had fallen. Crittenden's body was marked by numerous arrows. As we proceeded, we discovered Colonel Keogh and his troop, who appeared to have been retreating toward the hill where General Custer's body lay, engaging in combat as they advanced. The other soldiers we observed were dispersed across the terrain, generally trending toward the hill where Custer had fallen. At the summit of that hill, we located the remains of General Custer, his adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Cook, Colonel Tom Custer, several enlisted men, and horses. Close by, at the base of the hill, lay Lieutenant Riley, Captain Yates, numerous enlisted men, and additional horses. General Custer's brother, Boston, and his nephew, Reed, were found approximately 100 yards from his body. Only the bodies of Colonel Tom Custer and Lieutenant Colonel Cook exhibited signs of violence. All the corpses had been stripped of their uniforms, with most soldiers left bare, although some retained undershirts, socks, and drawers. The remains were situated on the eastern side of the river, beneath the main village, about 4 miles from Reno's position. On the afternoon of June 25th, as I rode out with the troop, I observed numerous Indians on the battlefield, riding back and forth and firing at objects on the ground, though we could not discern their targets. Later, upon reaching the hill where Reno's men were stationed, I heard gunfire for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, which then abruptly ceased. After interring General Custer and his soldiers on the eastern bank of the river, we proceeded to the western side to bury approximately 40 men from Reno's command. During our search, we discovered 2 Indian teepees containing the bodies of warriors, elegantly adorned and secured to a pole. Chief Low Dog later informed me that this method of body disposal was a mark of honor for valiant warriors, leaving their remains for the enemy to find. This was a sight I had never encountered before, and I believe these bodies were abandoned in haste as the Indians retreated, alarmed by the advancing column of General Terry. Surrounding the teepees, we observed a number of deceased ponies, equal in number to the warriors, arranged in a circle with their heads directed towards the teepees. From my observations, I estimate there were around 7,000 warriors present. In contrast, General Terry's command, which I knew to consist of about 500 men, appeared minuscule. The Indians indicated that General Custer's trail suggested he had ridden along the eastern bank of the river, which measures only about 15 to 20 yards in width at that location. Meanwhile, Reno's forces had crossed the river and launched their attack from the west. The riverbank was too steep to navigate until reaching a point approximately 3 miles from Reno's position. It was there that Custer likely discovered a ford and attempted to cross, only to be repelled and forced back to the location where his body was ultimately found. We encountered dead bodies along the route from the ford to the site of Custer's remains. Notably, Custer had shortened his long hair prior to the battle. His body was found unclothed but showed no signs of mutilation.